So in the new property across the tracks, he had this small stream called the Rue on the boundary of his property. So the plan was to dig a small pond and open a ditch to this stream so the stream would fill his pond. And then he'd plant it with water lilies and iris. Good plan, but he had to apply for a building permit in order to do this. And lo and behold, he was turned down. The reason was that the villagers nearby were fearful that the exotic aquatic plants he was going to put in his pond, i.e. the water lilies, they were fearful it would poison the water downstream for the livestock. Monet was in Rouen, painting the Rouen Cathedral series at this time, and when he heard the news, he was so angry, he wrote Alice to stop ordering anything for the pond and throw the new plants he'd ordered for it in the river. But Monet had a good friend who was a friend of the local magistrate and got the magistrate to intervene, and somehow they allayed the fears of the neighbors. And eventually permission was granted to Monet to build his pond, and I think we are all very lucky he did. So here's the pond and the small Japanese footbridge here. This garden was designed entirely differently from the Clos Normand. Instead of the straight lines, we have the highly asymmetrical, curvy, informal garden designed for an experience like a stroll path around the imperial gardens of Kyoto, Japan. The design is called a cup garden, where the pond is the bottom of the cup and the plantings along the banks are the sides of the cup. This design idea originated in Japan and then was developed further in Japan. It has an entirely different feeling from the Clos Normand. It's a garden for introspection, where the pond and the stroll path around it offer views inward, entirely different from the Clos Normand with its perspective views, its lines, taking your view outside the garden. And of course, the pond is surrounded, you can see here, by weeping willows and a tapestry of trees, which also enhance the view into the pond, into the mysteries of the pond. And of course, you see the water lilies here. Monet said, "It took me a long time to understand my water lilies. I had planted them for the pure pleasure of it, and I grew them without thinking of painting them. You don't absorb a landscape in a day. And then all of a sudden I had the revelation of the enchantment of my pond. I took up my palette. Since then I've had no other motif." I think this illustrates so very well how the art of the garden inspired the painting. So this garden was about the reflections. He planted the margins of the pond with water-loving plants like iris and rushes. But it was the reflections that mattered. The plants were really the setting for the water. See here, you see the pond plantings. See, this is a stilby here. The plantings were for how well they reflected in the water. So see how well this stilby reflects in the pond. Here are the reflections in the spring, where you can see them very clearly. Look at how the azaleas get reflected in the water, the flowering cherries, the weeping willow, and the beautiful cloud reflections. In autumn, it's the reflection of the Japanese maples, and they actually can look like red-orange fire in the water. So you've made your painting, and so what do? Of course, you frame it. Plus, this time you're framing not with man-made frames, but with by the weeping willows, and you get a lace effect as well. But there's also man-made framing over the path in order to feature the roses that Monet loved. Monet would visit the Bagatelle Rose Test Garden every year. He loved roses so much. Here you can see the roses close up. He actually helped to bring back somewhat the popularity of the rose, which had gotten relegated to the vegetable garden. June is really the time to see the roses. And more framing. This wisteria here had fallen down, and so they developed a trellis in order to hold up the wisteria. But you don't just have the wisteria on it, of course, you have the roses as well. And of course, it frames the rafts of water lilies. Monet tried very hard to keep the water lilies in these circular islands because the water lily pad is circular. And they have to be pruned almost daily in order to keep the reflections in the water, because the water lilies are very aggressive in growing. Also, they have to be careful about pruning the trees because they're trying to keep the reflections of sunrise and sunset in the water. Here's a good view of the boat dock as you come along the stroll path. Monet had a little Japanese rowboat here that he kept here so he could row out and paint from the middle of the pond. Pretty gorgeous framing, I'd say, for a boat dock. If you recall from the Claude Monet, there was very little ornamentation, man-made ornamentation there. He used mostly trellises and benches, and the same both in the Claude Monet and in the Japanese garden here. You don't see Japanese stone lanterns here or stepping stones. But the ornamentation he used, when you see this, you feel is really quite enough. So here's the famous Japanese bridge. Monet designed it from a Japanese woodcut print and had it built by local craftsmen. It is really on a perfect line with the Grand Allée across the road. You just don't get that impression because you enter via the tunnel. The canopy came considerably later, and probably from a friend's description of a bridge in Japan in the Sento Imperial Palace Garden in Kyoto. Monet never got to Japan, but his friend described what they think is this bridge in the Sento Imperial Palace Garden in Kyoto, and see how it's dripping in wisteria. So we think that his friend must have done a pretty good job of describing it, because then Monet put the canopy on his bridge and planted it with wisteria. I would love to show you it in bloom. That would have to be in May, which I would really love to have photographed it in bloom. I do hope to get there in May at some time. His wisteria grew so well. He had to actually cut windows in it in order to maintain the view through the bridge and get the reflection in the water. He loved the reflection of the bridge. This is a curved bridge. He loved the reflection in the water. And in some of his paintings, you can see the perfect oval that bridge provided when you combine it with its reflection in the water. Monet planted the weeping willow on the side of the bridge himself. Here is a close-up of the bridge with the weeping willow framing it. You can see the very enclosed feeling that you are getting from this garden. And here is your view from the bridge. You can see that this is not a very large garden. It's actually pretty small. Yet it inspired about 250 paintings. The last painting, which went a number of years ago, went for about $85 million. This is a beautiful combination with the rose-colored astilbe and the pink water lilies. And also you can see the red stalk on this tropical. Monet himself said that the water lilies were just the accompaniment, that the essence of his painting motif was the mirror water, whose appearance altered all the time due to clouds passing over, breezes which might move the trees and move the water, a shower which might be threatening and then fall. light which would fade and reappear, all these things which could transform the color and transform the ponds. So Monet would have his water gardener get up very early every morning to rinse the dust off the water lily pads, prune them into these circular rafts, deadhead the blooms, and clean the algae off the water before Monet started to paint. When Monet was in his 70s, and working on the very famous series of water lily paintings now in the L'Orangerie Museum in Paris, he said, "These landscapes of water and reflection have become an obsession for me. It is beyond my strength as an old man, and yet I want to render what I feel." Note, he said feel, not see. At this point, Monet was suffering very severely from cataracts. You can just imagine how terribly frustrating this was for him. But it has been suggested that his impaired vision actually helped him expand his technique, painting more from feeling and memory than physical sight. Painting this garden that he knew and he loved and could control more than if he were painting out in the countryside. Here's a close-up of the water lilies. Look at those reflections. Now we can see and understand why he loved the water lilies. This was a lovely combination by the pond. The purple from the smoke bush out here, the deep pink created by Astilbe, and then the white, lightened by the white of the calla lily. Monet liked to use purple smoke bush because it has a smoky, misty quality, just like the mistiness of the garden in the morning. And here's the bamboo. Monet had planted an entire large grove of bamboo. He also had the largest collection of Japanese tree peonies in Europe, acquired at great expense. By this time, Monet has said, "All my money goes into my garden." This is a side path in the garden. I included just to show you the wonderful, restful feeling to this garden, despite the fact that there are very often very many people in it. Here's one last view of the garden that inspired Monet for over 20 years. When Monet was 84 years old and he had worked in this garden and the Claude Monet for many years, he said, "My garden work is slow, pursued with love, and I do not deny that I am proud of it." Well, he had a right to be proud of it, but isn't that statement just like a gardener? His garden was always a work in progress, just like our gardens, always a work in progress. And here's our last view of the Claude Monet. Maybe it looks a little like an Impressionist painting. So Monet's garden was famous by 1900 and was visited by many and written about, which helped in its restoration. Monet died in 1926 at 86 years of age. His stepdaughter tried valiantly to maintain the garden, but it was a huge job, and you can imagine by the end of World War II, the garden was in ruins. Monet's son willed it to the French state. It was restored in the 1970s and opened to the public in 1980. It's open April 1 to October 31 every year, and every month would be a different visit in this garden. One of the lessons of many of Monet's garden is that garden design is a true art form. If the master considered his garden to be his greatest work of art, who are we to say it's not art? So now when you garden, you get to be an artist. But even more than that, maybe Monet's garden can encourage us to see our garden and the gardens around us more like a series of pictures, like paintings, focusing more on the big picture than on individual plants, and also to consider the feel of the garden. How does this garden make us feel? Then maybe we will be seeing and enjoying gardens in a whole new way. À la Monet. Thank you very much for listening.